Imagine waking up tomorrow, and every screen in your house shows the same image, a rock the size of a small moon heading straight for Earth 17 months out, and nothing on this planet can stop it now. Imagine begging 800 alien civilizations for help, and every single one of them saying no. That is not fiction. That is what happened to us. But here is the part. They did not expect. They thought we would disappear quietly. They were dead wrong. It was a frozen December morning when the sky broke. A physicist in Geneva closed her laptop, walked outside, and stood in the parking lot, staring upward for 40 minutes without moving. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She just stood there because she had run the numbers 3 times. And every time the answer was the same: extinction in 17 months, and nothing humanity had ever built could change that number by a single day. Only hope was the Galactic Confederation, 800 species who had ruled the stars for longer than humans had existed. We had been members for 2 centuries. We paid what they asked. We followed what they demanded. So when the rock came, Ambassador Lena Marin walked into the Grand Assembly Hall and asked them to keep their end of the deal. Hall was enormous tiers of seats, spiraling upward into the dark, filled with beings that made humans look like children playing in the dirt. One species had skin that refracted light into rainbows, and it was the most beautiful thing Marin had ever seen. And in a few minutes, that species would vote to let her entire world burn. We are requesting emergency assistance under Article 7. Marin said, her voice steady, her hands trembling beneath the podium. Earth faces total annihilation. We have honored every obligation for 200 years. Now we ask, will you honor your silence then? The Valari Grand Chancellor rose tall, angular, silver-white skin, like polished steel, the most powerful being in the most powerful species in the galaxy. He did not look at Marin when he spoke. He looked at his notes, as if this were a budget meeting. We have reviewed the projections. He said intervening would require resources that outweigh any strategic return. Your planet contributes minimal output. Your species holds no critical expertise. We vote against intervention. He said it the way someone declines a lunch invitation. One by one, the rest followed. The Senari said no. The Orentari said no. The Moroccan said no. Species. Marin had spent years building relationships with species. She had shared meals with, laughed with, trusted. Every single one of them looked at 12 billion lives and did the math and decided it was not worth the cost. Final count, 847 against 12 in favor of the Grand Chancellor offered what he probably considered kindness. The Confederation extends its condolences. Your species will be remembered with respect. Marin stood at that podium for a long time. After he finished, she looked out at 800 species who had just signed her world death certificate, and she did not scream. She did not beg. She did not give them the satisfaction. We will remember too, she said quietly. Then silence. Let that sit for a moment. 800 civilizations with the power to save 12 billion people just shrugged and walked away, and one woman stood alone at a microphone and said 4 words that would echo across 500 years of history. We will remember too. Confederation ships left Earth orbit within 6 days. They took everything, their technology, their embassies, their communication arrays. 2 centuries of partnership stripped away in less than a week, and then the sky was empty on Earth. A mother in Tokyo sat at her kitchen table and tried to explain to her 7-year-old daughter why the stars had gone quiet. She could not find the words, so she just held her and said nothing. A man Lagos stood on his roof and watched the last Confederation transport break atmosphere and disappear. And he whispered to no one, you cowards. A teenager in Sao Paulo spray painted a message on a concrete wall in letters 3 feet tall. They left us. Was it 3 images from a world of 12 billion? And they tell you everything you need to know. The grief, the rage, the silence. Humanity was alone. The universe had done the math, and we did not add up. For 15 days nothing happened. The radios were dead. The sky was empty. The world held its breath and waited for something, anything. Then, on the 16th morning, A technician at the Southern Hemisphere Tracking Station spilled his coffee because his screen lit up with signatures. He had never seen before ships, 40 of them golden brown, shaped like honeycombs, connected by thin bridges moving in perfect formation, like a single living thing breathing through 40 separate bodies. They were not human. They were not Confederation. They were something else entirely. Every defense system on the planet locked on Ambassador Morin. Stood in the command center, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Identify yourselves," she transmitted. The response came back in broken English. Clicks between the words, a buzzing hum beneath every syllable. "We are Cathari. We watched what was done. To you, we did not agree. We wished to speak." Marin had heard of them, small insectoid, barely 4 feet tall, a species the galaxy considered irrelevant. They had almost nothing, a handful of ships, a fragile economy, 0 political weight. They were nobodies. Why were 40 of their ships sitting in Earth orbit here is what you need to understand. What happened next did not just save one planet. It cracked open the future of the entire galaxy. And it started with a 4-foot-tall alien walking into a concrete bunker and saying 6 words to Ambassador Marin that made the toughest diplomat on Earth fall apart. Cathari Ambassador arrived the next day. Her name was Churika, and she stood barely 4 feet tall, 6 legs, 2 arms, compound eyes, the size of fists that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. When she spoke, her voice clicked and buzzed like something mechanical trying to learn music. She walked into a bare concrete room beneath the Capitol building and looked up at Ambassador Marin the way a surgeon looks at a patient before delivering bad news. "We watched the vote," Churika said. "We saw what was done to your people." Marin sat across from her and chose her words the way someone handles broken glass. "You are not a powerful species," she said. "I mean no disrespect, but the Confederation has millions of warships. They have weapons that crack moons apart. What can 40 ships possibly?" Dashurika tilted her head and made a rattling sound that Marin would later learn was laughter. "You are right. We are not powerful. We have few ships and almost no money, but we have engineers and we have builders, and we have hands that do not stop working until the job is finished." Marin waited. There was clearly more. Churika was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, slower, as if the words were heavy, and she was lifting them carefully. "We were slaves," she said, "for thousands of years. The Velari owned us, and when we finally broke free, not one species in the galaxy helped us, not one." She stopped, and Marin saw something move across those massive compound eyes, something old and unhealed. "So we know what it is to stand in the dark with no one coming," Churika said, "and we will not let your people stand there too. We are staying." "Why?" Marin asked, and her voice cracked on the word, just slightly. "Why risk everything you have for a species you barely know? Because someone should have done it for us," Churika said, "and no one did. That was it. No grand speech, no oath, no philosophy, just a 4-foot-tall alien in a concrete room saying the simplest, truest thing anyone had said since the sky went empty." Marin did not say thank you. She did not say anything because she was crying and she could not stop, and Churika reached out with thin fingers and touched her hand and said, "Do not cry, yet we have much work to do. The rock does not wait." That night the Cathari fleet began transmitting plans to every engineer on Earth, not proposals, not requests, just blueprints, a network of gravitational deflection stations spread across the solar system, each one generating waves of force aimed at the incoming rock. They could not destroy it. They could not stop it. But if they built enough stations and placed them precisely, the combined push would nudge the rock off course by a fraction of a degree, just enough to miss Earth by the thinnest possible margin. "This will take everything we have," Churika said, plainly, "every resource, every worker. Many of my people will die. The cold of space is not kind to our bodies." She paused, then added, "And we will do it anyway." Asked how they could share technology that other species sold for billions of credits, Churika answered with the only line the viewer needs to hear. Information wants to be used. It does no good locked in a vault. Take it, learn it, make it yours. And they gave all of it away freely, completely without conditions. Construction started the next morning, and for the first few weeks, it felt almost possible. Factories retooled, overnight workers trained around the clock, the first structural components launched into orbit, and Catherine and human crews began assembling them side by side in the Black Then station. 6 collapsed. It happened on day 43. A structural joint failed under stress, and the entire frame buckled inward, killing 11 workers instantly. 8 human. 3. Catherine, the debris field damaged 2 supply shuttles and knocked a second station out of alignment. The whole project stopped for 72 hours while engineers tried to figure out what went wrong and whether the remaining stations had the same flaw. Churika did not sleep for those 3 days. She sat in the engineering bay surrounded by human and Catherine designers running calculations, checking every joint on every blueprint. The answer came back on the 3rd morning: a manufacturing defect in the metal alloy being produced by a factory in Osaka. The alloy was 0.4% weaker than specification under the stress of vacuum conditions. It would eventually crack. Every station they had built so far used the same alloy we have. To rebuild them, Marin said, staring at the numbers, we have to strip them down and replace every joint. Churika looked at her, and for the first time, Marin saw fear in those compound eyes. Not fear of dying, fear of failing, fear that they had come all this way and the rock would win anyway. Then Churika said, no, we do not rebuild, we reinforce. We add secondary supports to every existing joint, and we fix the alloy formula. Now it will cost us 3 weeks, but we will not lose the stations we already have. It worked barely. The reinforcement teams worked in shifts that lasted 16 hours, sometimes 20, burning through supplies and burning through bodies. The Catherine suffered the worst. The cold of space attacked their joints. The radiation ate through their exoskeletons. They moved slower every week, and they did not stop. A human worker named Jae Soong watched his Catherine partner Ventik struggle through a shift one night. Ventik had been out for 14 hours, and his movements were stiff and trembling. You should go in, Jae said through the radio. Ventik clicked his quiet laugh. I will go in when this section is finished. Why, Jae asked. You are destroying yourself out here. Ventik was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that Jae would carry for the rest of his life. Because I can see Earth from here, and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever looked at, and I would like your daughter to see it too. Jae did not respond. He turned back to his work and welded through blurred vision. The months ground forward and the stations rose, but the cost was savage. Ships collided, workers died, equipment failed every week, brought new losses. Human and Catherine bodies released into the void together, wrapped in white cloth. And on Earth, families kept volunteering. Parents kept kissing their children goodbye and flying into the dark, knowing they might not come back. A young Catherine worker, barely past adolescence, asked Churika one evening why the human parents kept going. Because they are parents, Churika said, and parents will burn themselves to ash if it means their children get one more sunrise. And the Catherine hive mothers answered that truth by sending their own young into the construction zones. Their elders wept, but they let them go, because we cannot ask humans to sacrifice what we will not sacrifice ourselves. One hive mother said, by the 9th month half, the stations were operational. Resources were thinning, crew rotations were falling apart. And then rock was visible now in the night sky, a dark smudge growing larger every week, swallowing stars as it came closer. The clock was running out, and everyone knew it. But then something happened that nobody expected. The Catherine High matriarch, the oldest and most revered being in their civilization, announced she was coming to Earth. Her doctors told her the journey would kill her faster. She was already dying, her body shutting down after 300 years of life. She did not care. I want to see the world my people are dying to save. She said, I want to feel its air before I am gone. And what she did when she arrived did not just lift the spirits of the workers, it redefined what this entire fight was. About her ship landed in New Geneva on a spring morning. The cherry trees were blooming that week, pink and white petals drifting through warm air like something the planet had. Invented just for her, Thrinkle was carried from her ship on a golden stretcher, and the first thing she did was look up. Her compound eyes, cloudy with 300 years of living, turned toward the blue sky, and she went completely still. So much water, she whispered, there is water floating in the air itself. How do you breathe with all this beauty around you and not weep every single day, Ambassador? Marine met her on the landing platform and bowed deeply, but Thrinkle was not interested in ceremony. She lifted one trembling hand and said, take me to the water. I have never seen an open body of water. In my life, our world is dust and caves and darkness. I want to see what my people are dying to protect. They brought her to the shore of Lake Geneva and set her chair at the edge. With the small waves curled against the stones, Thrinkle sat there for a long time, not speaking, just watching the light move across the surface, as if the lake was breathing. Marin sat beside her, and after a while, Thrinkle spoke again, quietly, almost to herself. We evolved underground. Did you know that in caves so deep that light was a rumor? Our entire civilization was built in the dark. And here you are, a species that grew up under an open sky, surrounded by water and green in color. No wonder you fight so hard. No wonder your people will not quit. You are fighting to keep this. And I understand now. I understand completely. Marin said, we could not have done any of this without your people. You could not have done it without yours. Thrinkle replied, that is the whole point. Alone, either of us breaks. Together something holds. The Confederation forgot this. They see numbers, they see output projections and resource calculations, but a world is not a spreadsheet. Ambassador, you cannot measure what a civilization is worth by what it produces. You measure it by what it refuses to let die. She turned her cloudy eyes toward Marin, and her voice dropped. Promise me something, anything. Remember, us not as heroes, not as legends, just as friends. That is all we ever wanted, to be remembered by someone who cared. 3 days later, Thrinkle died in that same garden by the lake. Cherry blossoms were falling when she stopped, breathing pink petals landing softly on her still form, as if the earth was trying to cover her gently. Humans and Catherine stood together at her funeral, and someone started singing low and quiet, and then the Catheri joined in with their clicking harmonies, two sounds from two worlds that had no business fitting together, and yet they did perfectly. Now, here is where the story turns. Because the matriarch death did not slow the work down, it set it on. Fireworkers who had been running on empty found something new in their arms. Engineers who had stalled on problems suddenly saw solutions. Crews who had buried friends went back to the line with their name in their mouths. For Thrinkle, they said, for the one who came to see our world before she left hers. And they built faster than they had built in months. The final stations had to go up in the worst possible locations closest to the rock path, flooded with radiation and debris. These were the positions no one wanted, the positions where the survival odds dropped to almost nothing, and every single slot filled with volunteers, human and Cathri, both standing in line to take the shifts that might kill them, because the alternative was letting the rock win. And no one was willing to let that happen. Now, not after everything, not after her. And then the night came. 37 gravitational stations hung in the darkness of space, humming with power, every one of them built by hands that bled for this moment. The whole world went quiet. 12 billion people looked up and held their breath. The rock appeared as a shadow, first a dark shape sliding across the stars, swallowing them one by one. It grew until it filled a piece of the sky, visible without telescopes close enough that you could see the craters on its surface. Children pointed at it, and their parents pulled them close and whispered, it is the thing that will not kill us, just watch. The stations fired all 37 at once. Invisible waves of gravitational force slamming into a rock that had been drifting through space, undisturbed for millions of years, and for a long, terrible moment, nothing seemed to happen. The rock kept coming, the numbers barely moved, and in every command center on Earth and in orbit, people stopped breathing then. The trajectory shifted, not dramatically, not like a movie, just a tiny correction, a fraction of a degree, a nudge. So small, the instruments almost missed it, but the computers caught it, and the computers do not lie. The rock was going to miss it. Past Earth at a distance, so close the oceans pulled toward it. The tide surged, the ground trembled, and for one horrifying second it looked like it might clip the upper atmosphere. But it did not. It slid past close enough to touch, close enough to taste, and then it was gone, disappearing into the dark on the other side of the solar system. In orbit, Jae-sung and Ventik floated side by side, watching the rock shrink into nothing. Their helmets were touching, because the radio felt too far away for this moment. "We did it," Jae whispered. Ventik clicked once softly. "Yes, we did." And below them, Earth turned slowly in the sunlight, blue and green and white, and alive, because two species had decided it should be. The world wanted to celebrate, and it did for a while, but something else was happening underneath, something quieter. The Confederation sent congratulatory messages. Within hours, as if nothing had happened, they spoke of renewed friendship and fresh cooperation, as if 847 votes against had never been cast. They expected humanity to smile and come back to the table and pretend Earth said nothing. Marin gave one final address before she disappeared from public life. "They left us to die," she said. "They weighed our lives against their budgets and chose their budgets. We will never forget that, but we will also never become what they are. The Cathri showed us something better, and we will follow that path wherever it leads." Humanity went quiet after that. They kept their seat in the Confederation. They paid the minimum dues. They attended the required meetings, but they did not speak. They did not engage. They did not invest. They just watched, and the great powers did not notice, because Earth had always been background noise. To them, a small planet at the edge of nowhere. What could humans possibly be planning? They had no idea, and they would not find out for another 500 years. Beneath the silence, humanity was changing. The Cathri technology had cracked open doors no one knew existed. Engineers who had built the gravitational stations started pulling the designs apart, improving them, shrinking them, finding uses the Cathri themselves had never imagined. A Cathri elder watched a team of human students redesign a deflection engine to run at triple efficiency, and said, "We gave them seeds, and they grew forests." A scientist named Dr. Yuna Akiro spent 30 years chasing faster than light travel. The Confederation used fold drives, massive engines that bent space to create shortcuts. Every species in the galaxy used some version of this. It was considered the only method. Daiara Kuro found a better one. Her ships did not bend space, they slipped between the folds, moving through the gaps in reality, like water through cracks in stone, smaller, faster, more efficient than anything the galaxy had ever built. "How did you figure this out?" her colleagues asked. "I listened to the Cathri," she said. "They see patterns where we see noise. I learned to look through their eyes." Humanity began to expand, but not toward the wealthy core systems, not toward the trade routes the great powers fought over. Instead, they moved into the dead zones, the vast empty darkness between stars that other species had written off as worthless. What the Confederation called wasteland, humans called opportunity. They built colonies on frozen moons, mining stations inside hollow asteroids, research labs hidden in the electromagnetic shadows of dead stars, each outpost small and careful and invisible. And the Cathri came with them because they had nowhere else to go. The construction effort had drained their home world dry. Thousands of their people had died saving Earth, and the planet they left behind could no longer feed the ones who survived. Humanity did not hesitate. "Your world is our world now," the human president told the Cathri Council. "Your people are our people from this day forward. The two species grew into each other. Cathari children sat in human classrooms. Human children learned the clicking language well enough to argue in it. Families adopted across species lines. A human couple raising a Cathari child, a Cathari hive, welcoming human workers as full members within a generation. The line between them had blurred so deeply that most people stopped seeing it at all. Then the ashfall happened. It was year 112 a century into the expansion, and everything was going well too well. A massive solar flare from an unstable star hit the Vanek corridor, the narrow route connecting Earth to 17 of its largest outer colonies. The flare fried every communication relay in the corridor and destabilized the fold-spaced lanes that connected the settlements to each other. Overnight, 17 colonies, with a combined population of 800 million, were cut off completely. No communication, no supply ships, no way in or out. For 6 months, Earth heard nothing. The corridor was dark, the relays were dead, and every probe sent in was destroyed by residual radiation. Panic spread through the remaining colonies. People started asking the question that had been buried for a century. What if this does not work? What if we are not strong enough? What if we built all of this for nothing? Voices rose, calling for humanity to abandon the outer colonies, to pull back to the inner systems, where it was safe, to stop expanding and start protecting what they already had. It made strategic sense. It was the rational move. It was exactly what the Confederation would have done. Admiral Hannah Park Jae-sung, granddaughter, refused. She stood in front of the Colonial Assembly and said 3 words: "We do not leave," and she took half the fleet into the corridor herself. It took 4 months to fight through the radiation, to rebuild the relays, to reopen the lanes. When the first supply ships finally broke through to the stranded colonies, they found 800 million people still alive, still functioning, still holding together, because the colonists had done what humans and Cathari had learned to do. They had looked at the darkness and refused to sit down in it. The ashfall cost them 11 years of progress. It burned through resources that took decades to replace. It left scars on the expansion that never fully healed, but it proved something more valuable than any technology. It proved the philosophy was real. "We do not leave" was not just a slogan carved on a wall. It was a choice made under pressure, when abandonment would have been easier and smarter. And it held. After the ashfall, humanity expanded differently, slower, more carefully, with redundant supply lines and backup corridors built into every route. They had learned what the Cathari already knew. Survival is not about never falling. It is about what you choose to do when the ground drops out. The centuries rolled on. 100 years, then 200, then 3, and in the dead zones a fleet took shape. Not 100 ships, not 1,000, 3,000 warships, each one carrying weapons and shields, born from the fusion of human creativity and Cathari engineering, refined over 3 centuries. The hulls were marked with Cathari geometric patterns, honoring the species that had made all of this possible. The crews were mixed human captains with Cathari tactical officers, Cathari navigators with human weapons specialists. They trained in the void, far from any watching eyes. And they waited. A young captain asked Admiral J. Park when they would show themselves. Park was Hannah, grandson 4 generations removed from the construction worker who had welded alongside Ventic in orbit. The family had carried the story like a sacred text. "When will we reveal the fleet?" the captain asked. "When someone needs us," Park said. "When the galaxy learns what it feels like to be alone. And if that day never comes." Park smiled. Then 3,000 ships guarding the peace is not a bad outcome. In the core systems, the Confederation noticed nothing. They were busy with trade wars and border disputes. Earth was a footnote, a minor species that had gotten lucky. Once reports surfaced occasionally about strange ships in the dead zones, unusual energy signatures on moons. No one had claimed a Valari. Admiral laughed them off. What could humans possibly build out there? There is nothing in the dead zones, just rocks and silence. He was wrong about the silence, and then something woke up in the space between galaxies, something ancient, something that had been sleeping for 1,000,000 years, something that did not negotiate, did not explain, did not ask permission. It simply arrived, and it started destroying everything in its path, and the first civilization standing in that path was the Valari, the most powerful species in the galaxy. The same species that had looked at 12 billion human lives and said, "You are not worth the cost." Now, they were about to find out what it feels like when the cost comes for youth. First attack came without warning. 20 Valari worlds went dark in a single day, not destroyed in the way wars usually destroy things, not bombed, not invaded, just silenced. One moment, 14 billion. Voices were living, breathing, arguing, loving, sleeping. And the next moment, there was nothing. The sensors showed the planets were still there. The oceans were still there. The buildings were still standing, but every living thing on the surface was gone, erased, as if someone had taken a cloth and wiped the glass clean. High Speaker Velkar stood in the Valari command center, watching his empire shrink in real time. The tactical display covered an entire wall, a map of Valari space that had once glowed with the confident blue of total dominion. Now red zones were spreading across it like infection, blooming through a wound. His admirals were talking over each other, shouting orders, demanding reinforcements, arguing about defensive lines. But Velkar was not listening. He was staring at the red and thinking about how fast it was moving. "What are they?" he asked his chief scientist. "We do not know," the scientist said, her voice thin and careful. "The machines are constructed from materials we cannot identify. Their weapons operate on principles. We have never encountered their ships repair damage faster than we can inflict it. And their numbers appear to be functionally unlimited." Functionally unlimited, Velkar repeated. "Yes, High Speaker. For every unit we destroy, our sensors detect 2 new units emerging from beyond the galactic rim. We do not know where they are being manufactured. We do not know how to stop the manufacturing. We do not know what they want. We do not know why they woke up after 1,000,000 years of dormancy. We know almost nothing." Velkar looked at her, and for the first time in his long political career, he had no response. The Valari had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. They had conquered systems and broken rebellions and dictated terms to species that outnumbered them 10 to 1. They had always known more than everyone else. They had always been ahead, and now something had come out of the dark that they could not understand, could not predict, could not fight, and could not stop within. 3 months, the machines had taken 100 worlds. Within 6 months, the number was 300. The Valari fleet, the largest military force the galaxy had ever assembled, was being chewed apart battle by system by system. The machines did not tire, did not retreat, did not make mistakes. They advanced like a tide, and the Valari were drowning. Velkar called an emergency session of the Confederation. He stood in the Great Hall, the same hall where 500 years earlier his predecessor had looked at Ambassador Marin and told her that Earth was not worth saving. The same podium, the same lights, the same seats rising in spiraling tiers around him, filled with the representatives of hundreds of species. And he did something no Valari leader had done in recorded history. He begged. "We are dying," he said, and his voice cracked. In front of 800 species, the most powerful being in the galaxy stood at a microphone and broke. "Our worlds are falling. Our people are being erased. Our fleet cannot hold. We need help. We need everyone, please." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Velkar had ever heard. Then the calculations began, the same calculations that had been done in the same hall 5 centuries before, the same math, the same logic, the same cold equations that weighed lives against resources and found the lives wanting. The Senari representative spoke first. "We have analyzed the threat profile, and the projected cost of military intervention exceeds our capacity for acceptable loss. We cannot commit forces at this time." The Orinthari said no. The Moroccan said no. The Thesic said no. Species after species doing the arithmetic and arriving at the same answer, the answer this hall had always given when someone else was dying it. Kost's Tumuk Velker watched them vote, and he felt it happening to him. The thing he had only ever inflicted on others, the crushing, suffocating weight of being measured and found worthless, the airless void of standing in a room full of people who have the power to save you, and watching every single one of them decide that you are not worth the effort. This is what they felt, he said, and he was not speaking to the assembly. He was speaking to himself, to the ghost of a human woman who had stood at this same podium and said, "We will remember too. This is what we did." To them, this is exactly what we did. Is there no one, he asked the empty hall, is there no one in this galaxy who will stand with us? The hall was silent. The representatives looked at their screens, their notes, their hands, anywhere but at the Valerie. Leader begging for his people's survival. And then a technician burst through the chamber doors. High speaker. She said, her voice shaking, "We are detecting a fleet at the edge of Valerie space, 3,000. Ships, unknown signatures. They are not in any database." The display behind Velkar shifted, showing the sensor feed, and there they were, 3,000 vessels, dropping out of faster than light travel in perfect formation. They were angular and massive, built with a design philosophy the Confederation had never seen. Their hulls were dark, but painted across every surface in bright, precise lines were geometric patterns that made Velkar stomach drop, because he recognized them not from any current intelligence briefing, but from the history archives. From a file that was 500 years old, Cathori Patterns A transmission, cut through every frequency in the system, overriding Velari military encryption. As if it were not even there, a woman appeared on every screen in the command center and in the Great Hall and on the bridges of every Velari warship still fighting. She had silver hair cut short, a face that carried the weight of decades of command, and eyes that looked like they had made every hard decision the universe had to offer and come out the other side still standing. "I am Admiral Yuna Tanaka of the Human Cathari Combined Fleet," she said. "My task force is moving into defensive positions along your collapsing perimeter. We are here to help the Great Hall win completely." Still 800 species staring at screens, showing a fleet that should not exist from a civilization they had forgotten carrying weapons. They had never seen. Velker spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you come here after what was done to your people in this very hall? Why would you help us?" Tanaka did not blink. "Yes, you left us to die. We know, we remember every child born on Earth for the last 500 years has learned what happened in that chamber. They learn the vote count. They learn the words your predecessor used. They learned that 800 species decided 12 billion lives were not worth the budget line. We have not forgotten a single detail." "Then why?" Velkar asked, and there were tears on his silver face, "Because forgetting was never the point." Tanaka said, "Remembering is only useful if it teaches you something, and we were taught by the best 500 years ago. When this galaxy abandoned us, one species came, 40 ships, a few thousand engineers, a civilization that had almost nothing. They flew to Earth and said, 'We are staying.' And when we asked them why, they said, 'Because someone should have done it for us, and no one did.'" She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it carried harder. "That choice built everything you are looking at right now. Every ship in this fleet, every weapon, every shield, every piece of technology we developed in 3 centuries of silence. It all started with one small species deciding that compassion was more important than calculation. We are not here because you earned this, Velkar. We are not here because we owe you anything. We are here because this is the civilization that choice created, and this civilization does not leave people to die." Velkar could not speak. "Your children," Tanaka said, and her voice shifted, something raw moving underneath it. "Your children did not vote to abandon us. Your farmers did not sit in that hall. Your teachers, your artists, the mother putting her child to sleep on a Velari colony right now, on machines close in on her sky. She did not make this decision. She does not deserve to die for it. We will share everything we have, weapons that damage the machines, shields that hold against their Beams tactical frameworks that predict their movements, all of it free. No conditions, no payment, no debt, the same way that Catherine gave to us, because that is how this works. Kindness is not a transaction. It is a choice, and we are making it right. Now you fight with us, yes, Valkar, said the human fleet. Moved into position within hours, and the effect was immediate. Tanaka assigned her fastest ships to the most critical breaches in the Valari defensive line. Catherine tactical squadrons plugged gaps that the Valari had been hemorrhaging through for months. Human weapons systems fired on the machines, and for the first time since the invasion began, the machines took damage they could not instantly repair. The tide did not turn overnight. It did not turn in a week. The machines were vast and relentless, and the damage they had already inflicted was catastrophic. But for the first time, the bleeding slowed. For the first time, a defensive line held. For the first time, a Valari colony that was supposed to fall survived the night, and word spread through the Confederation, not through official channels, but through soldiers and civilians and refugees talking to each other. The humans came. The humans brought weapons that worked. The humans are fighting on the front lines. The species we abandoned came back, and they are saving us. War ground forward month by month, year by year. And in the third year, it almost ended at Korath. Deep Korath Deep was a Valari industrial system. 14 planets orbiting a blue giant star. It produced 60% of the repair components, keeping the Allied fleet operational. If Korath fell, the fleet could not maintain itself, and the war would collapse within months. Everyone knew this. The machines knew this. They sent something new, a command vessel 3 times larger than anything previously encountered, surrounded by a swarm formation that moved in patterns Allied tacticians had never seen before. The defensive battle Group 4. 100 ships was overwhelmed. In 9 hours, 200 destroyed the rest. Limping out of the system, Korath was falling, and with it the War Admiral Tanaka sat in her command chair aboard the Thrinkle, the flagship of the combined fleet named after a matriarch who died watching waves on a lake 500 years ago. She looked at the tactical display and saw what everyone else saw. The numbers did not work. The reserves were committed elsewhere. Reinforcements were days away. Korath would be gone by morning unless her Cathari tactical officer Vestchurin had been running calculations since the retreat began. She looked up from her console. Admiral, if we take the Thrinkle through the debris field of the first engagement, we can mask our approach. The wreckage will scatter their sensors if we get close enough to the command vessel. A direct strike could disable it, and when the command ship goes down, the swarm loses coordination for a window of approximately 10 to 15 seconds. Tanaka looked at her. How bad? Vess held her gaze. 60% chance we do not survive the approach. Bridge went quiet. Every officer, human and Cathari, looking at the Admiral waiting. She could feel the weight of the ship around her, the hum of the engines, the thousands of crew members in the corridors below, going about their work, trusting her to make the right call. She thought about Thrinkle sitting by the lake saying, "Remember us as friends." She thought about 40 golden ships appearing in an empty sky. She thought about a construction worker named Jae-sung, whose grandson now sat in a command chair somewhere in the fleet, carrying the same stubbornness, the same refusal to quit. "Take us in," she said. The Thrinkle went dark. Engines cut to minimum, running on drift and inertia alone, sliding into the debris field. Like a fish moving into deep water around them floated the wreckage of the first battle, shattered hulls, torn metal, emergency lights still blinking on ships whose crews were gone. The bridge crew worked in whispers, calling out distance and bearing as if speaking too loudly would wake the machines. 40 minutes they drifted through the graveyard of their own fleet. 40 minutes of silence and sweat and the sound of their own breathing. Vess counted down distances on her screen, her mandibles clicking so softly only Tanaka could hear it. The command vessel loomed ahead, massive and dark, pulsing with energy. It made the hull vibrate. "Now," Vess said. Thrinkle lit up everything at once. Every weapon system, every energy reserve, every last piece of power. The ship could give all of it focused into a single sustained strike on the command vessel. The impact was blinding. The command ship cracked down its center energy, bleeding out of it like light through broken glass, and the swarm stuttered 11 seconds. The swarm drifted out of formation. Their movements uncoordinated, their targeting systems confused 11 seconds of chaos. And in those 11 seconds, every surviving Allied ship in the system fired from every direction, hitting the disoriented machines from angles they could not defend. Korath held the Thrinkle survived. Barely, her hull was torn open on 3 decks atmosphere, venting into space 94 crew members. Dead damage that would take months to fully repair, but she was still flying, and the war was still alive. Tanaka sat in her chair, surrounded by the sound of damage alarms and the smell of burned metal, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she opened a channel to the fleet. Korath stands today because people chose to fly into the dark when the numbers told them not to remember their names, all of them. The war continued for 8 more years after Korath, and it was the hardest thing the galaxy had ever endured. The machines adapted, constantly developing new weapons, new formations, new tactics. Every time the Allies found an advantage, the machines evolved past it within weeks. The Allied forces had to evolve faster, had to think differently, had to find new ways to fight. Every single month, species that had never spoken to each other learned to coordinate in battle. Human aggression, paired with Cathuri precision Velari, heavy firepower directed by Sinari electronic warfare, Orintari medical ships saving wounded from every species without checking their identification. First, the war was forging something that politics never could, a galaxy that fought as one body, bled as one body, grieved as one body. The other Confederation species joined the fight. As the years passed, some came because they were inspired by what humanity was doing. Some came because the machines reached their own borders, and they had no choice, but they came, and once they were in the line, fighting beside humans and Cathuri, something changed in them. The old calculations stopped making sense when the person next to you in the trench is from a species you once voted to abandon, and they just saved your life. The math breaks down and something else takes its place. The final battle happened at the galactic rim, the exact point where the machines had first appeared. 10,000 ships from dozens of species assembled in the largest fleet action in recorded history. Admiral Tanaka commanded from the bridge of the Thrinkle, now scarred and patched and held together in places by field repairs that her engineers swore would hold, and her Cathuri crew said a prayer over just in case. She was old. Now her body was failing. Her hands shook when she held her coffee, and she had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 11 years. But her mind was clear, and her voice still carried when she gave the order, all ships forward, weapons free. 3 days the battle lasted, 3 days of fire and metal and death. Human ships charging alongside Velari cruisers, Cathuri fighters diving through machine formations, Sinari destroyers providing cover for Moroccan troop carriers. The losses were staggering: hundreds of ships, thousands of lives. But the Allied fleet pushed forward because there was no backward anymore. On the 3rd day, Vesturin, now promoted to captain of her own squadron, identified the factory ship, the massive structure at the heart of the machine force that manufactured their endless replacements. She transmitted coordinates to every ship in the fleet, and the entire armada turned as one and drove straight for it. The factory ship fought back harder than anything they had faced. Walls of beam fire that cut through shields, waves of drone units that threw themselves at the advancing fleet ships, died by the dozen. But the fleet did not stop, because 10,000 crews from dozens of species had all made the same choice, and the choice was forward. Thrinkle fired the shot that cracked the factory ship main reactor, and when it blew, the light was visible across 3-star systems. The remaining machines went still, then dark, then quiet, drifting lifeless in the void, like leaves falling from a dead tree. It was over. Tanaka sat in her command chair while the bridge erupted around her. Cheering, crying, embracing. She did not move. She was looking at the tactical display, watching the red zones disappear one by one, replaced by silence. Thinking about every name on the casualty lists, every ship that would never come home, every family that would get a transmission. Instead of a homecoming, was it worth it? Her first officer asked, standing beside. Her Tanaka was quiet for a long time. Asked. The children, she said, ask them in 100 years, when they are growing up in a galaxy that does not know what fear tastes like. Ask them if it was worth what we paid, and we will know the old Confederation of Aligned Worlds did not survive the war, not because anyone destroyed it, but because no one believed in it. Any more, its founding philosophy that the worth of a species could be calculated, that help should be rationed based on strategic value, that some civilizations deserved to exist, and others did not. All of it had been tested in the fire, and all of it had burned to nothing the species who had followed that. Philosophy had nearly lost everything. The species who had rejected it had saved the galaxy. The evidence was not subtle. In its place, something new had to be built, and they built it on Earth. Representatives from every surviving species traveled to New Geneva, to the garden where Thrinkle had died 500 years before. The cherry trees were still there, descendants of the same trees that had dropped pink petals on a dying matriarch. New gardeners had tended them across the centuries, knowing somehow that this place would matter again. A Cathari ambassador named Sure Ventara, descended from the crews of the original 40 ships, spoke first. Her compound eyes moved slowly across the assembled representatives, taking in species that 500 years ago would not have given her people a second glance. 500 years ago, my people made a choice. She said, we had almost nothing: 40 ships, a few thousand engineers, a home world that could barely feed us. We flew to Earth because we could not stand by and watch a world die. We did not know what that choice would become. We did not know that humans would take one act of loyalty and turn it into a civilization that could save the galaxy. We just knew it was right, and that was enough. She turned toward Admiral Tanaka, who sat in a wheelchair, now her body finally surrendering after decades of refusing to humans. Taught us something we did not expect. She said, we thought we were giving them a gift, but they gave us something greater. They showed us that kindness does not disappear. When you give it away, it multiplies, it grows, it comes back in ways you cannot predict. One choice to stay became a fleet, one fleet became a war, one war became a galaxy standing together for the first time in its history. Tanaka rose from her wheelchair, slowly, painfully waving away every hand that reached for her. She stood on her own feet, because she had always stood on her own feet, and she was not going to stop now. We were alone once, she said, and her voice filled the garden, carried by speakers to every screen on every world watching. We were nothing, a small planet at the edge of nowhere. 12 billion people who had been told by the entire galaxy that they were not worth saving. And then 40 ships appeared in our sky. She paused. That was all 40 ships, and the courage to use them, and it was enough. It was more than enough, because they gave us something no weapon and no technology could match. They gave us an example of what a civilization could be if it chose something other than fear and profit. She looked out at the hundreds of representatives standing before her. This alliance will not be like what came before. We will not measure the worth of a species. We will not calculate the cost of compassion. We will not run the numbers on whether a dying world deserves our help. We will simply be there when someone needs us, the way the Cathari were there for us, the way we were there for the Valari. The way from this day forward, we will be there for each other. The new galactic covenant was signed that afternoon in the shade of the cherry trees. Its seal showed a circle of hands and appendages, human and Cathari and Valari and Sinari and dozens of others, all interlocked. Its founding principle was carved into a stone placed in the garden next to the spot where Thrinkle had sat watching the waves. No, One gets left behind. Admiral Yuna Tanaka died 2 years later on a quiet evening in her home on Earth. Her granddaughter was beside her, holding her hand, and in the last moments before she closed her eyes, Tanaka said, "Remember the Cathari, remember what they taught us, and pass it on." And across the galaxy, in the years and decades and centuries that followed, something changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily like water. Wearing stone species that had spent their entire histories measuring and calculating and competing began to ask a different kind of question. Not what is it worth? Not what do we gain? But what would it mean to simply be there for someone? What would it cost to show up when no one expects you? To what kind of galaxy could we build if we stopped running the numbers and started running toward each other? The answer was still being written across 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 lives, but it had started in the simplest way possible: 40 ships and a single choice, made by a species that had nothing except the memory of what it felt like to be alone, and the refusal to let anyone else feel it too. That was enough. That was always enough.